In the previous videos, you went through the 4 steps of conducting a climate change vulnerability assessment. These are developing a list of climate change indicators in step 1, determining your exposure to these indicators in step 2, assessing how sensitive your area will be to the identified climate change indicator in step 3, determining your potential impact from climate change from the result of step 2 and 3. And finally, step 4, assessing your adaptive capacity to respond to these impacts. This assessment helped to determine your vulnerability to each of the indicators. In this video, we're going to look at how you can use the climate change vulnerability assessment to develop a list of priority climate change indicators. These are critical areas that will require responses in order for you to minimize your risk and vulnerability to climate change. You will remember that when you started the climate change vulnerability assessment, you developed a complete list of climate change indicators for each sector in South Africa. You will also remember that a climate change vulnerability assessment is a process used to determine which climate change impacts are most important for your area. In order to prioritize your most important indicators, you began excluding indicators that were not relevant or important. Those indicators that you answered no to for exposure implies that you did not expect the particular indicator to take place in your area. Those that you answered low or medium to for the sensitivity question implies that the indicators are not relevant or of only medium importance to your area. And those that you responded high or medium for adaptive capacity implies that you have some systems in place already to respond to the potential impact. Through the short listing process, you are now left with the indicators that are a priority for your area. You should therefore make a list of the indicators that you scored the following for: yes for exposure, high for sensitivity, low for adaptive capacity. We went through the 2 examples in the previous videos. These were increased impacts on informal dwellings and increased risk to livestock. For the first example, increased impacts on informal dwellings, you scored yes for exposure, high for sensitivity, and medium for adaptive capacity. This is not a priority indicator because you scored medium for adaptive capacity. So there are systems in place to deal with this issue. For the second example, increased risk to livestock, you scored yes for exposure, high for sensitivity, and low for adaptive capacity. This is a priority indicator because this is an important and sensitive issue and you have no capacity to respond to it. Remember, the aim of the climate change vulnerability assessment is to determine which climate change impacts are most important to you. These are the impacts that are potentially significant or have high sensitivity and there is currently limited adaptive capacity to respond to the potential impact. The next step involved shortlisting these potential impacts to a list of most critical indicators through a prioritization exercise. You have now gone through the entire vulnerability assessment, having started with an extensive list of climate change indicators and ending up with a list of priority indicators for your area. Conducting a climate change vulnerability assessment is only a part of a process in preparing for climate change. The next step is to begin identifying projects and responses to the priority indicators. These responses can be summarized in your climate change response plan. And from there, you need to make sure that the results from your climate change response plan are integrated into your municipal IDP and spatial development plan.